Good morning to everyone. The disadvantage, my name is Carlos Sanchez from the Valencian Center of Irrigation Studies. I've been working there for 20 years and I'm also an associate professor of the University of Valencia. The problem of being the last talking is that maybe you are a bit tired before the coffee break, but the advantage is that the ones who spoke before me have introduced very many subjects which are related to the things I'm going to say now, and they will let me go a bit faster. I'm going to focus on the case of Valencia. I'll explain to you which was the experience of the modernization of watering system in Valencia using data, starting from data. There's a series of studies on a group of 67 area farmers associations. Right. We've got to focus on the context we have been dealing with because a bit of a different farming. And if we speak about modernization, it's important. Not the same patterns can be used everywhere because depending on the region, agriculture can be different. In the case of Valencia, of the central part, we're talking about small farms, very fragmented plots, mainly dealing with citrus fruits, and a collective management of irrigation through farmers' communities. This is important for you to understand how it has been, the modernization has been introduced. There was, after the most severe drought, the region suffered from in years, and the hydrological plan failed, so the modernization of irrigation system seemed to be a win-win situation. If the ones waiting for a future water transfer, as by those who wanted to survive without a new water transfer. The government was interested, also farmers, so there was an expansion of drip irrigation, and it was turned into a synonym of modernization. People wouldn't say, I'm going to shift into drip irrigation, but rather, I'm going to modernize my farm. And in this environment, massively centralized fertigation was introduced because of the type of crops and because of the collective modernization in irrigation cooperative. Well, if this problem was launched with the aim in mind of saving water, these are the results in 67 irrigation cooperatives. You may see the ones which were modernized. There were some 60 which had that bad, but that should be compared with the cooperatives which had maintained the flat irrigation. And we saw that the ones which became modernized, the ones working on citrus fruits or mixed patterns, had enjoyed a gross savings around 50%, whereas the ones which had not become modernized also reduced the use of water in their cooperatives around 27%. And why? Not just because of technical improvements, but also because there was a bigger pressure on the resource, so they had to reduce the use of water because of competition. But in general, we see that there's a difference, a significant difference, around 25%, which can be attributed to the introduction of modernization. So in terms of use, there was a perceivable, significant gross savings. In terms of net savings, the figures are smaller, and the basing board of the Júcar region, I've got to say that there's not a very precise monitoring of the basins. We are in fact working on this issue. There's an estimate of around 8% of net savings. We'll look into the final figures, but they do not see to be inconsistent. And why? Some of the reasons have been already mentioned by Juan. The fact that the rebound effect happens, which reached a science journal and which was in the literature on modernization, for that effect to happen, a series of conditions should be met, which are external to technological change. One, that there are changes in the crops, because they either become intensify or because of varieties. And this did not happen in Valencia because in general terms, the type of crops was maintained, citrus fruits, and the newly introduced crops were crops which use either the same amount of water or less water. Second, there was no expansion of the watered area. Irrigated area is going down in Valencia. In the 90s there was an expansion, but because of the aging of farmers, it's become stagnated. It is true that in some environments, basin authorities, basin boards, use drippers as elements to expand certain areas, and in some areas at the head of the Vinalopó, it was detected that the Federation allowed for an over-exploitation of resources if this would be done in systems which would not use gravity flooding. So in some points this technological tool was used to promote expansion policies. And another possibility is that the resource which was theoretically saved can be brought into other uses. With regards to environmental use, sometimes you've got to think that maybe the resources being lost or saved are used to improve the quality of ecosystems. And for example, we have the case of the Albufera. Albufera is at the tail of the Júcar system and is going to be affected by modernization of systems. We're working in that replacements of resources to be effective. So these resources can be reintroduced in the Albufera. Also, there are issues having to do with the use of energy. The people from the University of Cordoba worked a lot on these, and we see that the final costs of transformation have been very favorable to farmers in terms of stability. There were increases in water tables, but there was also a reduction of cost in institutions which mixed up surface water. Why? Because when dripping was introduced, that led farmers not to use underground water, so a replacement of resources effect took place. So the perspective of generating savings in terms of dams should be deleted, because in the end the underground water, which is the most expensive water, is not yet used. So in mixed systems, in the end there will be joint use systems, and underground water will be left as a guarantee for supply. But this would not be thought of as a concept which will allow for savings. The thing is that when we interview the farmers and not the managers of the cooperatives, 57% of farmers would tell us that they had to use drippers because of being forced to them, because the management boards of their cooperatives force them to do that. Sometimes many of them, they do not attend the meetings because they trust the managers. So even if they thought that drippers were imposed on them, they were happy because in the end everyone was satisfied with the change. And farmers just use the water they need. They don't waste water. Maybe you can act on the overall system, but Valencian farmers wanted to be more comfortable, to use more conveniences, having to go less to the plot, because they were aged farmers. And they wanted to reduce labor costs, and they also wanted to increase production a little bit. But it was mainly conveniency what concerned them, or they were part-time farmers, so the reduction of the working time was essential for them to dedicate some time to other things, to a different profession. This so far is the analysis we've done on savings and the cost of irrigation. I'll focus now on institutional aspects, how regions, the cooperatives are changing because of this technological change. And we see three elements: focusing, adaptation, and privatization. We'll see what outsourcing is and what privatization is. It can be dealt with in two forms. And there's an excess atomization of irrigation in Valencia, and public plans should have simulated the integration of institutions where when the plots are atomized. So when new infrastructures are created, joint boards would have introduced swift changes, and the tele-management systems make it easier for decision making not to be as on the plot, but in a distant point. So there are no farmers doing the irrigation themselves, guards, and the profile of the people in these institutions have changed. And traditional know-how now has gave way to a modernization of the profession. They have increased their education. So there are engineers now managing the plots. And as in this region, they have chosen centralized fertile irrigation, the problem now is how it now is affecting organic producers. They will lose their certification, and centralized fertigation becomes very complex. And there's also a question I'm going to transfer onto the next speakers. I want that question to me, and it is in terms of rights. Will that single user the right to get clean water? What would it happen? There are differing opinions, diverging opinions. What's the situation in terms of the legal framework which affects these people? Well, of course, when legislation was drafted, these things were not in the mind of socialists. And then we enter into the second concept, adaptation. This means that thanks to this technification of farmers' cooperatives, irrigation cooperatives, farmers and cooperatives are adapting the hardware they got and replacing elements of the software. For example, the case of centralized fertigation and organic farming, we see that there are farmers who are building alternative piping before the fertilization point, before the chamber, so they can have clean water. And also there are people using alternative shifts, irrigation shifts, because there's a cleaning of all residual fertilizer in the pipe. So sometimes a lot of water is used for cleaning the piping, or a long period of irrigation shifts, which is a problem for the rest of farmers. So it is still a problem to be solved, and on which people are working now.
Lo que hemos observado es que muchos de estos sistemas
observed is that many of those drip irrigation systems that were installed 20 years ago, that was by companies who had a pattern which was actually just taking this pattern to all the places, and they wouldn't adapt to local conditions. So some problems appeared when pumping, filters, etc. So also we have the sectorization and pressures not very well calculated, and farmers didn't realize all of that unless they had a able technician and were carrying out some tests. With this, nowadays they're spontaneously redesigning by those technicians the irrigation systems. I have to say also that some of those mistakes were not because the product was standardized, but because the system was a little bit perverted. Because the companies building those systems, they wanted to reduce costs in the project, but not in maintenance. So they installed devices that at the beginning were very attractive, but that in the long term were not economically efficient because they were very expensive to be maintained. So this adaptation or redesign of systems is taking place. Finally, a third phenomenon, and with this I will finish, which is privatization. This is more clear. There is a range of some forms of externalization and full externalization. There is a whole range in between. In the several areas in Valencia this is happening, and also in other areas in Spain. What is happening? These drinkable water companies that are being taken away from their sources of water because there are remunicipalization processes, are looking for new market working places, and sometimes these companies use this drip irrigation as the main topic, because when they use the new system they just appear and offer themselves to maintain the whole system. Sometimes just to have part of the services, but we've seen cases in which all functions are taken by them, controlled by them, manufacturing, maintenance, etc. And they do not let farmers get the information on the water consumed. It's all sealed. So some trust elements and transparency elements are being destroyed, and that was basic in the irrigators community, because that guaranteed the sustainability of those institutions, and that was done for many years. So we have to be very cautious with cases like this. We've had reversion cases in which, irrigating communities, after having given all the entity to all the management to a company, they have retaken the management again. Also some companies that when they saw that the cost increased, cost increased, then they took it back as well, because the managing is not done as carefully as when the owner is in charge of that, because the company is thinking about the industrial benefit, which is not going to go back to the users, and that's what's traditionally been done. So we're seeing some reverse cases or insurrection cases, so community of irrigators that have just blocked these operations of privatization or externalization. So these three words allow us to define what the changes are in the irrigation sphere in Valencia. And to finish, apart from this, apart from this work, we're also cooperating with the Valencia government in the future modernization plan, and we are working on this, organizing workshops with farmers, with irrigators communities. We've contacted more than 200 irrigation entities. We have organized meetings and participation workshops. 20 of them were representatives from different kinds of communities, and we're trying to identify what the needs and the issues are at this moment in irrigation in Valencia, to implement a second process of modernization, which will not be based on drip irrigation, but it will be based on energy efficiency, and the search for an improvement in the performance, also based on training and all aspects that allow us to identify local needs.